Discovering Kanban, presented at IT Palooza, December 2014. Hi, my name is Eugenio Alvarez. I'm a South Florida software development professional, and I've been focusing on Agile development since 2013. First three-part introduction, something new. You may have heard of Agile software development as the way to go. You probably have heard of Scrum and XP. But there's a relatively newer form of Agile called Kanban that's been gaining market share in the last few years. So the introductory question is, why use it? Kanban's recent popularity stems from its ease of implementation, use of visual cues, ability to handle a wide variety of software development and operations teams. Some groups have turned to Kanban when other methods didn't work for them. So the questions. So what exactly is Kanban? How is it related to other Agile methods? When would you use Kanban versus other methods? Is Kanban right for my group? And if it is, how do I get started? So these are the questions we'll cover in this session. We start off by what Agile method to use. The backstory. September 2013, we're going Agile with a Scrum team. So a new product was commissioned and a group of developers was hired for the express purpose of creating a new product for a specific market. So the question is, what about the other teams with just one or two developers? The journey to find the appropriate Agile method begins. So what happens is start taking training classes, including Scrum Master and Product Owner training, Scrumban, and other training classes, videos and audiobooks, and trying to get an understanding of the market and understand what would be the appropriate methodologies for the smaller teams. I take a look at the surveys that were available to understand what was being used. So we take a look here at the State of Scrum report from the Agile Alliance in mid-2013. The question here being posed is, what Agile approach is your organization using? Select all that apply. And as you may notice, of course, that Scrum has a high percentage of respondents, but Kanban has also quite a few people saying they're using it. So what is it about Kanban that is triggering the use of those folks? And that is what led me to start thinking, maybe Kanban is something that I need to take a look at. We take a look at this other report. This is the State of the Agile Development Survey from version 1. This is the end of 2013 from this particular survey. And quoting from that survey, Kanban continues to gain market popularity among teams with a 7% increase. Now you notice here in this survey, you see that Scrum, XP hybrids, Scrumban, and Kanban are present. What we'll do is we'll take a look at these individual methods and try to compare them and see how they match for the teams that I needed to find a methodology to match the Scrum team. First, let me step back and talk a little bit about frameworks and methodology. So a framework is an incomplete set of practices needed to build software. Gaps are filled in by additional tools or methods. This is in comparison to a methodology, which includes a full set of practices and tools needed for the software construction, and it's common in that case to kind of remove things that aren't applicable for your environment. What's happening is that the Agile methods are becoming more adaptive and less prescriptive, and what you're seeing is that the number of roles and activities and artifacts is decreasing. We see here from this chart from Kanban and Scrum making the most of both. And you see that we start with Rational Unify with 120, and we see XP Extreme Programming substantially less, so it's more along the lines of the framework that I specified. And we then see Scrum and then Kanban, you see they're specifying less, allowing more to fill in to make a methodology. So now at this point, we'll take a look at these methods that we saw in the Agile survey. We'll start by the most popular one, Scrum. So Scrum is an Agile software development framework. Scrum originates from the rugby term scrummage, and it's inspired by the new product development game by Takeuchi Nonaka from the 1986 Harvard Business Review article. So we step back and we take a look at Scrum's inspiration, the new product development game. And we see here the 6 products that were featured in that article in the Harvard Business Review. And the commonality between these is that these were all by larger Japanese companies that chartered small groups to make a new product. In the case, for example, the Fuji Xerox, the team was put together from, it's a cross-functional team from research and development, operations, production, sales, and they were given 2 years to come up with a machine for half the cost, but still performing as well as the current high-end machines. In the case, for example, of the AE1, the group was put together and tasked with creating a camera for 30% lower cost compared to existing models, even with the inclusion of automatic exposure and introducing a lot of electronics for the first time. So these are all similar stories in which a larger corporation basically charters the creation of a product, and a new group is created, a multi-cross-functional team to serve the needs of the new project. So it leads us to a question. Understanding Scrum is, we start thinking to ourselves, at least for myself, to Scrum Bud or not to Scrum Bud. So Scrum Bud is a term that's used to say, okay, you're doing Scrum, but you're not doing something of its requirements. You're not doing it correctly. So that's the question. The Scrum requirements are a team size 5 to 9. So it's 7 plus or minus 2, a cross-functional team with additional specified roles besides the team size of a Scrum Master and a product owner. It also introduces the concept of time boxing. Basically, every activity inside Scrum is time boxed with an overall framework. The outside cycle is a sprint, which is intended to be without interruptions, because you're estimating what you can do in that sprint, typically 2 to 4 weeks. So when I look at these requirements and I look at the team sizes that I was looking for a methodology of 1 individual, maybe 2 individuals, I was not given a green light to just hire more people to make them staff up to the point that they're size a Scrum team. So if we just work on one project with 1 individual, obviously it's not Scrum as intended. So we take a look at Scrumban. Scrumban is a combination of Scrum and Kanban. It was coined by a guy named Corey Ladas, and Ladas worked with David Anderson. And it was controversial at the time, and because when he originally talked about this in 2010, he was saying that, well, there's no point in Scrum. Everything needs to be Kanban. I'm not saying that that's the case. But that's what he was talking about at that time frame. And so what we see is there's a wide variety of combinations of Scrum and Kanban that could be considered Scrumban. We start with what Ladas, the way he describes it, is a Scrum, and start introducing inside the process of Scrum some Kanban practices. And then evolving, he goes this like level 2, and it keeps on going, where eventually when you remove the time boxing, then at that point it's not Scrum, it's Kanban, because Kanban focuses on continuous flow. The requirements associated with this don't change. So as far as looking at this as an alternative that would handle smaller amounts of developers, that was not the case. So we move on to the next method. So Scrum XP, so Extreme Programming, it's a hybrid, a combination of the Scrum framework with extreme programming practices. And we find that after taking a look at this, this is pretty much what's happening with Scrum teams. They are, in general, as they evolve, it's not a starting requirement, but in general, they adopt extreme programming practices. So what happens is that you can see extreme programming was its own standalone method, a framework, and the names of the different you know activities are just basically when you're adopting the engineering methods, but you're keeping all the Scrum versions. So as far as requirements are concerned, that's there's no change here. This is basically additive. You're filling in the Scrum framework with Agile XP engineering practices to try to make a methodology. So as far as team size and my requirements for this, finding a method for the small teams, it didn't change and it didn't seem applicable. Then we see the Kanban method. A little bit of background on Kanban. It's a agile software development method. It originates from Japanese term. Kan means visual and Ban means board. It was influenced by lean manufacturing, the Toyota production system, and Eliyahu Goldratt's theory of constraints, developed by David J. Anderson. So why use Kanban? Its ease of implementation, acceleration time to market of software, more easily managing priorities, better alignment with IT and business objectives, increasing productivity, and enhancing quality and project visibility. We'll see that later on in the slides coming up. How does it achieve these things, and why is it that it's applicable? Before I do that, I want to step back. I want to step back and discuss a few terms because I'm going to be defining things and talking about things. One of the things that I noticed is in other presentations, these type of terms are not defined, causing some bit of confusion with folks that have not become familiar. So I want to go and define these terms: flow, push, pull, TPS, and lean. So what is flow? Flow is in terms like an assembly line, is cadence. It's getting stuff outdoor at a pace. That pace enables hyper productivity. So this is Henry Ford here, and looking at a assembly line from the early 20th century, and this is in terms of Henry Ford's flow lines. There's another term associated with flow, and that's, don't want you to be confused when I say flow. I'm talking about this flow lines. There's the other terms is sort of like being in the zone, and Csikszentmihalyi, the famous psychologist, is basically saying like things are in the zone where you're focusing. So when I'm talking about flow, I'm not talking about focusing. I'm talking about it's just a cadence and getting it out. So when we talked about push, we're talking about mass manufacturing. And in this case, we're looking at Henry Ford again. And one of his famous quotes is, any customer can have a car painted any color he wants so long as it's black. That's not a typo color. That's the way Ford wrote it. So we're talking about push is mass manufacturing, large quantities, large inventories. Ford had large inventories of parts. He had large inventories of manufactured cars, and they was pushed out, and it wasn't feedback from the end user. It was all they were all black, and they were focusing on lowering cost by making large quantities. Then we have pull. So pull is, I find that, folks that are not familiar with lean terminology get confused when I use the word pull. So pull is the grocery store analogy, and you see items are refilled based on customer pulling inventory. So in this case, we see a picture of someone pulling frozen dim sum from a grocery store, I believe in Hong Kong. So the thing here is that there's not large amounts of inventory somewhere. There's not a huge frozen dim sum factory somewhere with huge amounts of inventory waiting for folks. What happens is the grocery store every few days, every week, it would check to see the inventory, and based on the inventory, the quantities that the customers actually purchased, it would reorder, and the dim sum factory would make the items. So it was a less wasteful scenario that you're just making. It's like a gas gauge. They look at the inventories and then they reorder. Then we start looking at the term TPS, the Toyota Production System. So I'm defining it as some of the other terms we just defined. The Toyota Production System incorporates the concepts of Ford, of Henry Ford, the flow and the pull of grocery stores. So what happened, and why talk about car manufacturing? Well, the specifics is of the influence in software construction in this case. The history is that the guys at Toyota wanted to use Henry Ford's model. But what happened was that there was a combination of things that didn't make it applicable. Right after World War II in 1940s, late 1940s, there wasn't a lot of money to have the inventories, large inventories like Ford, and large inventories didn't make any sense because there wasn't a big, vast market in Japan at the time. So you couldn't use the Ford model. So the inspiration is the pulling, using the grocery store model. Actually, that was coming from inspiration in the United States grocery stores, and combining the two, making the Toyota Production System. There are many more aspects to the Toyota Production System besides flow and pull, but these are the two that we're focusing. And the two gentlemen on the right are credited for the creation of this, Taiichi Ohno, from the late 1940s all the way until the mid 60s, where this gentleman worked on perfecting and evolving the Toyota Production System, and Kiichiro Toyota, which is the founder of the Toyota car manufacturing company. These fellows, this particular Kiichiro was the guy with the idea, and Ohno was the one that actually developed over several decades. So we're going back, and we're looking at Kanban and TPS, and it's interesting how that's associated with the terms that are being used, because here's Taiichi Ohno's definition of Kanban. You see these are Kanban cards from the Toyota Production System. So when you see in Japanese, a Kanban is just like a signboard, so that specifically in the Toyota Production System. And it's the method inside the Toyota Production System that is a frequent form where it's using these papers and these little cards, and they're keeping this inventory to implement this pull model. So that's going back to the relationship of the actual term Kanban. Finally, we're looking at the last term, Lean. These fellows, three fellows, wrote a book at the early 1990s, Womack, Jones, and Roos, and they provide a comprehensive description of the Toyota production system. They call it a lean system. So this is where the term becomes popular. And they argued that it's not just a triumph in manufacturing, but of every value-creating process, from healthcare to retail, and in our case here, software construction. There's a wide influence, including from application of these methods to companies, startups. For example, Eric Rice's book, The Lean Startup, to portfolio management, operations, and so forth. The Kanban method includes many of these lean principles and practices. So review. So we talked about flow, which is about cadence; push, which is mass production; pull, which is inventory, refilling items.
Toyota Production System, which incorporates flow and pull, lean, which is the term that's used as distilling what's in the Toyota Production System. And now we can actually move on to actually define Kanban as what Mr. Anderson defines Kanban in his Blue Book. And he describes Kanban with a capital K as the evolutionary change method that utilizes Kanban with small k pull systems, as in TPS, visualization, also something that's in the Toyota Production System, and other tools to catalyze the introduction of lean ideas into technology development and IT operations. So Anderson's Blue Book on the bottom right-hand corner is kind of the book that started, at least that's the one that I read to start it. Now that's not the current as of this session in 2014. Another book from Mike Burrows, Kanban from the Inside, is the one that's now being used for training. So after talking about all this TPS and the word Kanban and where it comes from, you would be kind of thinking in terms that, okay, obviously this Kanban method is coming from Lean, Toyota, directly applying it, and that is not the case. At least what's happening is Mr. Anderson, what you see here, I say that it's not an immediate descendant. What happens is that in the early 2000s, Mr. Anderson was focusing on his method, and he was using the theory of constraints, Eliyahu Goldratt, which is a very influential book, The Goal, The Process for Ongoing Improvement. And it talks about drum, buffer, rope, capacity, constraint, resource. And Mr. Anderson was applying the theory of constraints to agile software development in the early 2000s. He really did not, at that point in time, see that it's lean. So contemporary, when Anderson was writing his book, the Poppendieks, Tom and Mary, were creating lean software development. That's a different book. So I wanted to bring this up because when you see material on Kanban, it's common to see the Poppendieks material being introduced as well as Anderson's material, combining the two. But there are distinct differences. One side effect, because of the Anderson's evolution, there's a less emphasis on Japanese terms. So we actually go to the Kanban method itself. So what we're going to be going over is its guiding principles and core practices. So there is a new, as of 2013, late 2013, 2014, Mike Burrows' 9 Values is also very common, introducing Kanban. For the sake of brevity, not including the values, I'm just going over the 4 principles and 6 practices. So what are the Lean Kanban method principles, core principles? So they start with what you know, agree to pursue evolutionary change, initially respect roles, responsibilities, and job titles, encourage act of leadership at all levels. Okay, so what we have is the core. Now we have the practices, which is visualization, limiting work in progress, managing flow, making policies explicit, implementing feedback loops, and improving collaboratively and involving experimentally using models. So stepping back through the methods and principles, the start with what you know aspect on the principles is part of the ease of implementation with Kanban, which is so appealing. So now we'll go over the practices, the 6 practices here. So the visualization, we see a Kanban board, and it's visual work management. So you have a couple things that are happening here. So you see the electronic version, and you see a physical board, and what's happening is that it you actually see, you have the feedback. It's an information radiator, so you can see what is going on at any point in time. It also helps with the process because you're defining your process and you're adhering to it. You also have limiting work in progress WIP, and we have a quote here from Eliyahu Goldratt, Critical Chain, where he talks about the impact of multitasking has on lead time as more items are undertaken. You begin more things and you complete less in a timely manner. So Kanban is about completing things versus getting a lot of things started and having a lot of things in the air. So the work in progress limits are the ways to allow focusing to just get things done. You have managing flow, and you have the common diagram called a cumulative flow diagram. That basically what you do is, and you have a Kanban board when you're having a value stream. That means the steps that you use, and you're actually listing these steps, and you're counting the number of items are in each step over a period of time. And this shows you the flow, the cadence going through, and the smoother the slope is going up, the better you are at breaking down. And you're seeing where you have these big chunks of work where the flow is impeded, and your goal is to get the flow and get continuous improvements out to production. Making policy explicit. So we have board rules. What you have is the board itself is created in a way that when you're actually physically going through the board, and it helps enforce the process. But you also, at the same time, when you put something on the board, you have rules that you can put on there to say, hey, a particular item is just going to be no more than 2 to 5 days, because if you take longer than that on an item, then you don't have flow. So then you need to break down those items into smaller pieces. Implementing feedback loops. So Kanban has daily stand-up meetings, weekly replenishment meetings, and monthly operations review. So the daily stand-ups are equivalent to the Scrum stand-up meetings, and they're different. In Scrum, it's the individual is going and saying, what did I do today? What did I do yesterday? What am I doing tomorrow? In Kanban, you're what's called walking the board, where you're going from the right to the left. You're going through the items, and it's a focus on the items. You may have one person, or you may have multiple people working on one item, and what is the state of that item, and moving the elements on that board from the left to the right in this pull, using pull. So this is similar, but not exactly the same as daily stand-up in Scrum. So the replenishment meetings are associated with talking to the stakeholders, the business stakeholders, and putting those items that are going to be using on the board, breaking them down and making them ready to be used. This is equivalent to the sprint planning, and the operations meeting are equivalent to the sprint retrospective, kind of having the feedback and seeing which things worked well or didn't work well. So the evolve and change, improving collaboratively. This is what's happening is in that retrospective type of activity. You're looking and you're doing small changes, and then making sure that things are going in the right direction. Things are getting done. So now we say to Scrum, to Kanban, or both. So you go through a series of questions associated with the selection of method. Do you have separate teams for new development and maintenance? As we saw the example in the Scrum's inspiration, these large companies are making these teams for specific new developments for a specific charter. So what would be, I would think would be applicable is to use Scrum in that manner. And if you have maintenance teams, it might be applicable to have Kanban on those teams. Do you have enough people for a cross-functional Scrum team to begin with? Because I did not. So that's one of the reasons where I didn't go and start using Scrum. For those methods, the Scrum team continued, but these smaller teams gravitated to Kanban. Can you focus, even if you have the team size, but and the cross-functional team, but can your team focus on 2 to 4 weeks cycles without interruptions? You can have some interruptions and manage the flow, as far as the time boxing. But if you have maintenance and new development concurrently, especially if you have a very much a changing environment, it doesn't apply very well to Scrum, and Kanban may be the appropriate one for you. And finally, the company culture. What happens is if, like for example, Scrum introducing these specific roles of a Scrum Master and so forth, if the company is not in favor of these new introductory roles, then Kanban is the obvious method that you would go with. So if these questions are right for you, then you may be asking yourself, okay, how do you get started with Kanban? So I propose as a starting point that you can do a lot of different things in the way that the current Kanban method is described by Mr. Anderson, but I call Proto-Kanban to get you some results without a lot of investment to start off with. Basically, you get a whiteboard, you map your value stream. The simplest scenario would be a to-do, a ready, work in progress, and done. You make a board rule to say work in progress is limited to 2 items per individual, and the individual is working on 1 item. The second item is the next item that person will work on if there's any blockage. And starting daily stand-up. That's what is a way for you to get started with Kanban and provide some of the benefits of Kanban. And this particular Proto-Kanban would be applicable to security, operations, development, all the above. So finally, we have the conclusion. Kanban provides an agile method that works along with other software development methods or by itself. Kanban's ease of implementation allows for its deployment in a wide variety of environments. Kanban has a significant improvement over ad hoc software development, and Kanban is a method that can be considered for all sorts of aspects in IT, including portfolio management, software development, operations, security, all the above. Thank you for watching this video. Now we'll have the references.